Okay, welcome back to the second video in the how to answer the questions for paper 2, Edexcel paper. Today we're going to look at the 12-mark question on the Elizabeth side of the paper. But obviously everything I say applies for all the 12 markers for Edexcel. So the ingredients of a good answer is quite simple for this one. 3 pure paragraphs. I've written there on the screen that you want to be aiming for 2 to 3 pieces of evidence per paragraph, ideally. And then the key thing is to make sure that your explanation is really strong. So the question will kind of encourage you to, or the question will have a specific focus. And when you're doing your explanation, you want to really clearly address that focus. So let's have a look at an example question. I'll talk you through kind of what I would be doing when I first see the question, what points I would come up with, and then I will write one paragraph, maybe two if I've got time, which addresses the question. So this is the question that we're looking at. So explain why treatment of the poor changed in the period 1558 to 1588. So the first thing I would do when I see my question is, before I even look at the stimulus points, I would start to underline what the examiner is asking me to focus on in the question. So we're looking at treatment of the poor, and the key thing is, how does it change? Okay. So the key thing is, we need to be, when we're explaining, we need to be thinking about, well, how is this treatment different from how the poor were treated beforehand? And don't worry, you don't need to know what, the treatment of the poor was like under Henry VIII's period or Mary I. You can just work backwards from what we know from the content that you're talking about. And that'll make a bit more sense when I talk through how I'd go about answering the question. Now, the exam board will always give you 2 stimulus points. So in this case, we've got government action and poor relief. And I encourage you to sometimes use the stimulus points, but remember, they're optional. So if those are confusing you, then by all means, write points that you feel more comfortable with. Okay, don't feel like you're pressured into using those points. Now, if I was looking at this question, I probably might do something like this. So I might do, for my first paragraph, I would focus on government action. And in particular, I'd be focusing on violent government action. Okay. And I'll talk through what evidence I would use in a second. My second thing is, here I would focus on poor relief. This is still government action, but poor relief had been around beforehand, but it sees some significant changes. So changes to the poor relief. And again, I'll talk through what I would be mentioning for that one. And then for paragraph 3, I might go over something like the increase in the population of England. Okay, now before I go through the evidence, I will just very briefly talk through how I would explain how each one changed the treatment of the poor. So the first thing is that the fact that the government now introduces violent laws, that's unprecedented. So beforehand, there'd never been any laws calling for violent action towards poor people. So that's a significant change. For poor relief changes, we can see that this is the first time that a government has tried to put in place a formal mechanisms and support for the poor. Again, beforehand, the support for the poor would vary. And so the fact that Elizabeth tried to deal with that is a positive step. And then the increase in the population of England, I would be looking at my, trying to give some really key population stats and how that changes. And ultimately, my explanation, I'd be saying, well, given that there was more people who were poor, this led to more unemployed people. And if there are more unemployed people, they would turn to vagrancy, which is obviously where you have poor people moving between cities. And that then puts more pressure and may lead to a more negative reaction or negative treatment, sorry, from members of the public. Okay, so I'd be really playing up with considering why this increase in population is going to have a negative knock-on effects for how those poor people are treated. Now, from the flashcards, there are a variety of flashcards that are relevant. So I would be looking at all of the ones to do with poverty. But just to keep it simple for the sake of this video, this is the main flashcard. So in particular, for paragraph 1, the evidence I'd be focusing on is the 1572 Vagabonds Act. For paragraph 2, if I just do that in a different color, the evidence I would probably be focusing on for that would be the Poor Relief Act, and then also the Statute of Artificers. And then for paragraph 3, I'd be looking at the increase in poverty flashcard, which is a different one. So make sure you've got the flashcards up. And I'd be talking about here. So the fact that the increase in the number of able-bodied poor meant that Elizabeth was forced to introduce new laws to control them. It also leads to what's the word? It also leads to a need for a distinction between different types of poor. So I would probably link in the fact that impotent and deserving poor versus the able-bodied poor. So the deserving poor, the people who actually need the help, versus the undeserving poor, those who could work but who are unemployed. Okay, so just for the sake of this video, I will write paragraph 1 on violent government action, and then I will, after that, if I have time, I will move on to, I will potentially write paragraph 2. Okay, so let me just get this slide cleaned up. Right, here we go. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to start by doing is really addressing the question. So I'll say one way in which the treatment of the poor changed during Elizabethan England was through the introduction of legislation allowing violence against vagrants and vagabonds. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to start with is a real clear point sentence where I'm using the wording of the question. Notice how I'm using the treatment of the poor and the word changed. Those need to be mentioned throughout your answer. I'm now going to move on to my evidence. You've got two options. Either you can do evidence, explain, or you can just do all your evidence and then all your explanation. I'm going to do the second option because it's easier and it's what most of you should be trying to do. Because at this stage in GCSE, you just want to get your evidence down and then do your explanation. So I might do something like, in 1572, Elizabeth introduced the Vagabonds Act, which criminalized vagrancy and the act of begging. Firstly, poor people, in the first instance, poor people would have a hole drilled into their ear to signify they were beggars and to act as a warning. The second time they were caught begging, they would be imprisoned, and if they were caught a third time, they would then be okay. Okay. So the first thing so that's my evidence done basically. All right. As you can see, I've got multiple pieces. So first thing, I've got a date. So I've got 1572. I've then got my Vagabonds Act, which is a specific, again, we want a specific evidence. We don't want Elizabeth did lots of things to deal with the problem of begging or lots of violence. We want specifics, okay? Dates, names of laws and so on. And then I've picked apart what the Vagabonds Act did. So I've picked apart what would happen in the first instance, what would happen then in the second instance, and then what would happen in the third instance. Okay, what I need to now do is I need to now explain, and my explanation needs to be developed. So it needs to be a couple of sentences. So I'll say this was an important change because it was the first time that the government had introduced laws which punished poor people, or which punished poor people and made the act of begging fine. Okay. Now, a lot of you are just going to pause and just say, okay, that's me, don't move on to the next paragraph. If you want the top marks, you need to go beyond that, okay? So we can then say, this meant, so as a result, the government was much harsher in its treatment of the poor beforehand. And in so doing, so this is where the top level students will try and make their answer really sophisticated. And in so doing, this may have also had an effect on how ordinary people behave towards the poor, given, for semicolon, given that the government was treating the poor in such an awful way, this opened the door for general hostility and violence towards vagrants. Okay. So the key thing there is I've got my point sentence, which I'll highlight in red. I've then got my evidence, which I'll highlight in blue. And then, as you can see, look at the size of the explanation, guys. To get the top marks, you want to make sure your explanation is really detailed. All right, and I do two more paragraphs exactly like that, and then I should be looking at top marks. Okay, right. I hope that you found that useful. I'm now going to make the 16-mark video on how to do that, and I'll try and write a couple of paragraphs for that one, or at least an intro, and yeah, an intro and a couple of paragraphs, because that's probably the most difficult question on the Elizabeth paper. I hope you found that useful, and thank you very much for watching.